Can I please ask our following presenters for the next component of the morning to please come up? I know Dr. Budlinder will be joining us online, but Nico and Michael, could you please come and join us on stage as we transition to the second part of the conversation? Sorry, Sbu as well, please come up. Exactly right. Two key things for me came up from the first part of the conversation. The first is growth is a necessary but insufficient condition for full employment. And I think that's necessary and important. The second is that context matters. Context matters for employment for individuals, to your very helpful points, Pelele, but also, and I think the analogy you gave is such a good one, the quality of the soil in which you plant the tree matters significantly. And I think a big part of the work that we do and what we're very much preoccupied with is how you change the quality of that soil, because it's critically important for the outcomes that we get from an employment perspective. So with those two reflections, and thanks again for those very, very helpful opening remarks and contextual points, can I then ask for us to move into the second session of our presentation, the second session of our morning? We will have shorter presentations from Josh, then Nico, then we can have some reflections from Michael. I know we've also got a colleague in the audience from the HSRC who has some reflections as well. And then we move to Q&A. So if we can keep it tidy, we'll have a good amount of time for a Q&A. So my plea to all of us is to work together to get that right. Thanks so much. So over to you, Josh. Thank you so much for...
And thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to present. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm glad to at least have this opportunity. I'm Josh Budlinder. I'm an academic economist at SALDRU at the University of Cape Town, and I work really in labor economics, and one of those areas is about public employment programs, which I'll talk to you about now, but I also work on unemployment more generally, and I'm very looking forward to the discussion. Right, and what I'm talking to you about is kind of the multiplier and productivity aspects of public employment programs, and specifically what we can learn from the education sector. And to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, really what that means is the Basic Education Employment Initiative. And I'm going to start by telling you what that is. I think most people know, but maybe people don't know the full scale of it. And then I'm going to talk about some of my own work, which is trying to, with Ihsan Basir, which is trying to kind of trace out some of the potential stimulus effects, the first part of the stimulus effects of the Basic Education Employment Initiative. I want to explain what that means. And then I'm going to talk about some work from Callie Ardington about how the programs like this can improve educational outcomes for students. And then lastly, some lessons from the Binding Constraints Lab on some key lessons from the rollout of the Basic Education Employment Initiative. But just to start with the BEI, what is it? Because I think people have heard of it, and maybe people do know something about it, but might not appreciate its scale and some of its details. So from 2020 to 2025, the BEI was the largest youth employment program in South Africa. And this graph gives you some idea. This is over 5 phases of the program, but it employed hundreds of thousands of people across the country. What were they doing? Well, these people were employed as what are either called education assistants or general support assistants in schools. And these are young people below the age of 35, typically, though there were some exceptions in different phases, who from those school areas, they applied, and then if they were selected, they got paid. Initially, it was the national minimum wage. Now it's around 4,000 Rand a month, up to 40 hours a week, basically to assist schools. And that could mean if you're an education assistant, it could be things like helping kids with reading or learning IT stuff. Or if you're a general support assistant, it could be something like being a handy person or something like that. And basically, you often have, say, 10 teaching assistants. I mean, that's not everybody likes that language. I'm just going to use teaching assistants to refer to education assistants plus general support assistants. And you would have maybe 10 or 20 of these young people assisting teachers, assisting schools per school. And what that means is that this program has a huge footprint because schools in South Africa are distributed across the country, including in the poorest areas of the country. So you had this local employment and this teaching assistance, whatever that was, spread widely across the country. It's a massive intervention which took advantage of the fact that when it comes to public employment, infrastructure is a really core constraint. But with schools, you already had the infrastructure because schools exist and schools have management processes and schools have teachers, that kind of stuff. All right. Like I said, there were 5 phases of the BEI. It started in December 2020 as a kind of emergency COVID response. And then it basically had a version of it every year except you'll see for 2024, which we'll come back to at the end when there were administrative issues. But it's employed, between 320,000 to 200,000 young people in each phase, which obviously is really, really massive. So it's a big intervention. But one of the things that's really stark about the BEI is I've been involved in evaluating it a little bit here and there. And the BEI, just being involved in watching it and a little bit of evaluation, it also illustrates this. It's a big program, but it also illustrates the scale of the problem. So in this last phase, the 2025 phase, though there were only 200,000 opportunities available, 1.7 million, 1.65 million people applied for those 200,000 jobs. So that really shows you the scale of our issue, that you have so many people applying for these jobs when there just aren't enough jobs to go around. Okay. All right, so that's the BEI implemented by the Department of Basic Education and a kind of key cornerstone of the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program. This now I want to talk very briefly about a paper that I did with my colleague Ihsan Basir. It's called Stimulus Effects of a Large Employment Program. And a spoiler alert, that large employment program is the BEI. And really what we were trying to see here is, how do wages from people being employed in the BEI circulate throughout the economy? Because the idea is that when somebody gets a job, especially say it's public money, somebody gets a job or a grant, it's not just the case that money goes to them and then it stops, right? That money goes somewhere. And what we're interested in seeing is, does that money support other economic activity from other people? Now, I'm not a macroeconomist, and there are some macroeconomists or public economists on this panel, so people can, talk to me a little bit about this in the discussion. But I think just to give some people an idea of what we're talking about whether spending encourages economic activity, is to think about what economists call the multiplier. And really the idea is that if somebody gets 100 Rand, what's going to happen with it? So the first point is that there are kind of two places that that money can go. If I get 100 Rand, just as an illustrative example for a job, I can either save that money, right? In which case it kind of gets removed out of the spending system I'm going to talk about. And so people regard that as a leakage, but savings are still important, not just for the individual, but for the economy as a whole, because savings can finance investment under some circumstances. But the point is that what we're really interested in here is that when people get this money, they're going to spend some of it, right? And they may spend it, for example, on informal traders or at big chain stores. And then what that spending now becomes income to the store, right? And what we're really interested in here is what the store does with that money. That's determines whether the spending is going to be about expanding economic activity or not. Because if the store basically says, okay, I've got increased demand for my goods now, because there are all these teaching assistants in my area, and the store just decides to increase prices and therefore absorb this fully in profits, that doesn't really expand economic activity, right? But what we can see from a whole lot of data is that often when stores and businesses in general get increased demand, they expand to take advantage of that increased demand, right? They want to sell more goods. And what that typically means is that they're going to hire more people, because you need more people to sell more goods, whether that's in a retail store, that's cashiers, or whether that's in a manufacturing firm and you need to actually more people to make more goods. And alongside expanding employment, typically also goes expanding wages, because you want to retain your workforce or you want to encourage more people to apply for the job. So this is kind of the key multiplier mechanism, that as demand expands, some part of that is going to be used to expand local employment and wages. And that means that when this teaching assistant got that job, it's not just them who gets a job, but potentially other people as well in the private side of the economy. And this process then recirculates, because if the retail store now needed to sell more bread, they go to the flour mill and they buy more flour. And then the flour mill, maybe they need to also expand employment. Maybe the flour mill now needs more wheat, and so they go to the farmer, and maybe the farmer needs to expand more employment. And at each point of this stage, those employees are also buying more goods. And so the idea is that you can have this kind of virtuous cycle where you can kickstart some economic activity, and it has benefits beyond just the individual who received that job. There are leakages along the way, right? So some goods we import. That's not going to expand local production. And what we were interested in here is seeing what kinds of stuff do teaching assistants spend on, and what can we expect in terms of the multiplier effects of this spending. So the way that this happened is that we had this amazing data partnership. Yesterday I spoke a lot about data partnerships between government, was the DBE, and the presidency, and an NGO, the Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, which people will know here, a private sector partner called Omniscient, which is a data platform, and then also one of the biggest, largest retailers in South Africa. And really, what happened here is that there was this Omniscient has that technology which allows you to kind of match anonymously and securely without sharing data, ID numbers in different systems. They convert them to an anonymized ID, so you don't see the ID number, the IDs stay on site, but you can match data sets across different groups. And what happened basically is that the DBE and Harambee, they have the ID numbers of people who are teaching assistants, right? And people who applied to be teaching assistants but didn't get the jobs. And this big retailer, they've got all the spending data about who spends in their store, because when you get a little loyalty rewards kind of program from a store, that's got your ID number on it, and then they see what you're spending on. And with Omniscient, we developed this way where you could basically ping this big retailer database and say, we see spending from person X. Is person X a teaching assistant? Or is person X somebody who applied to be a teaching assistant but wasn't included? And that's a control group. And the retailer never sees that. Only the researchers see that. And we don't see the ID number or anything like that. We just get an indicator, 0101. These people are teaching assistants and these people aren't. And what that meant is, using this data, is we could see that when somebody becomes a teaching assistant, so this bit over here is before, and this is when they become a teaching assistant, their spending substantially increases compared to people who applied but never became teaching assistants. This is about a 15% increase in spending at this one particular firm. And we can see what kinds of goods they buy, whether it's groceries, toiletries. I don't have it here, but there's a hardware store, a hardware section in this particular store, that kind of stuff. So we can see the spending, which is the first part of this program, and we can start seeing how this employment, this money from this employment, recirculates through the economy. Now, to then guesstimate and say what the multiplier effect is requires a lot of extra assumptions. We're just going to be not really going to go into that here, but we kind of estimate that it creates around about 100 extra jobs per month. Let's say 10,000 Rand a month just at that retailer. That retailer is then also got its whole supply system, and that means that you've got incomes going to local firms. 70% of the spending goes to local firms in the terms of local incomes in the form of either higher labor income or capital income of local firms. Some of it does go outside the country, and that we can extrapolate this and we can get a little bit further to 1,800 jobs per month if we expand our estimates. This is all very approximate here, and in fact, it's all massive underestimates, which we can talk about if we want to in the Q&A. But the point that we want to make is that with a good enough data, you can see, even though they're big underestimates with this data, you can see some of the spending recirculating through the economy. And the point here is that jobs and incomes do have positive spillover effects. When the public employment program is a job for the individual, but it's also about kickstarting economic activity. Of course, if it's financed from taxes, you have to then think about, well, am I reducing economic activity in another area? But Justin briefly spoke about Keynesian economics. There's a whole literature which suggests if you redistribute from high-income people to low-income people, it can have a bit more of a stimulating kind of effect. But Michael can talk a little bit more about that in his agreements and disagreements. But what's important about the public employment program is that it's not just money that somebody receives; they're actually doing a job. Right now, do these teaching assistants actually increase outcomes in schools? We don't have really clear evaluations yet for the BEI, right, which is this massive program. But we do have evidence from a very similar program, small scale. Not completely similar, but a similar program implemented by Funda Wanda with the DBE in Limpopo, where we have really high quality evidence. And what they did is there were 120 schools, quintile 1 to 3 schools in Limpopo, looking at grade R, 1, 2, 3. And Funda Wanda does these teaching materials like workbooks, and randomly they said, these schools are not going to get any intervention. These schools are going to get these learning materials, and this third group of schools are going to get learning materials and teaching assistants. And what does this do for educational outcomes? And what you see, this is for grade 2s, is that there are substantial increases. So you do get some increases from LTSM, stands for these learning tools like workbooks and stuff, and LTSM plus TA is you get the workbook plus you get a teaching assistant. And you see there are substantial increases compared to the no intervention schools when it comes to the people who got these teaching assistants. The learning materials help a bit, but teaching assistants substantially increase reading outcomes and early grade maths outcomes for these schools. And so now this is not the BEI, right? This is a small program, very bespoke. They put a lot of effort into gathering individual researchers, individual teaching assistants and vetting them and stuff. And the BEI is a mass program. So the results are not going to exactly go through. And we need evidence of that. But what you see is that there is this big effect on outcomes in a similar kind of program for schools. So this is productive employment, potentially, we hope, in the BEI as well. Okay, the last thing is I'm just going to talk about what are some of the lessons for scale that we got from the BEI. And this draws from Binding Constraints Lab, which was we did a partnership with DBE. This is me outside my wheelhouse. So I'm going to be a bit quicker here. This is the kind of qualitative stuff that I know a little about, but lessons. What are the lessons regarding scale from the BEI? The first point is that the BEI happened because there was this emergency when it came to COVID, and people didn't say, we're now going to take 10 years to design a program. They said, this is an opportunity. We've got the infrastructure. We know schools are struggling. We know young people don't have work. We're going to push for this. And people took risks. And then they learned as they went. So the one big lesson is to seize the opportunity and iterate. They brought in more people from outside government, NGOs and stuff, like it's particularly Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, because there are financial constraints on government side. And the DBE redeployed people within government to get the program working. They had a whole there's lots in the report here, which I won't talk about that. I'm not an expert on, about how to decide what to centralize versus what to delegate to provinces. My reading here about this recommendation to build strong data systems is that for achieving scale, that's really important. And I think that's a lesson that they learned, is that the data systems weren't always so strong and they were kind of doing it as they were going, and that created hardships. But when they did get the systems working, they really meant scale was much more possible. And this are kind of the last 2 points I just want to talk about. The BEI, because it's a thing of kind of you starting small and then just taking opportunity and then iterating, is it still is basically an emergency intervention. So every year there's a question, is it going to be renewed, right? Where's the funding going to come from? And that means nobody can really plan around implementing. People get paid late. People don't know when they're going to start. You can't plan the program properly. And this is why in 2024, there was no BEI, because there were really difficult administrative issues around its funding. That's a huge problem. If we've got something which works, and if government's going to do it anyway, because it is happening every year, though it hasn't happened this year so far, then it needs to be done on a kind of more predictable basis and actually built into budgets so people can plan. Money is going to be spent, it seems, so why not do it with some planning and then allow better outcomes? Similarly, there's very little information right now on its impact, right? That's why I was talking about this other education program to try and get some idea. And part of the reason there hasn't been an impact is because of monitoring and evaluation budgets. But the other reason, which is close to my heart because I'm evaluating this program, is when everything happens at the last minute, because it's not planned, you can't really design a proper evaluation. All right, so just to end, the BEI is the largest youth employment program in SA. It's a cornerstone of the presidential employment stimulus. We can see that incomes from public employment can benefit downstream industries and workers. We can see that teaching assistants can, in another program, substantially improve educational outcomes, and there are lessons to be learned from rolling out the BEI at scale, which I think particularly are around institutionalizing the program rather than just an ad hoc emergency extension every year, and also about doing some more evaluations. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Very helpful. I will keep this sort of rolling, so we've got enough time for Q&A. So I will hand over to you, Smooth, through your reflections. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Is there a clicker? Is it okay if I stand at the podium? My security blanket.
Not your security detail.
Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the flu.
I've worked with them.
And flu is a real thing, no matter what anyone says. I'm going to be talking a little bit about international examples. And before I go into the presentation, which I'll keep very short, I do want to say I represent my co-authors today, Prof. Annette Bergman, and our now former colleague, Meg Breyer, not Bryant, that's not her name. And really what we wanted to do is to talk about what we know and what we don't know. And I'm really happy to be presenting on the second day today because I don't have to speak to this, and for a lot of people in the room, this is their lived experience. So I won't go into this, as tempting as it is for an economist to do. What we were interested in this paper is trying to see where we could find some areas of overlap, some areas of synergies with countries that have tackled this before. One of the things I do have to say at the onset is that we are a very unique country, both in very positive ways and in very negative ways. Our starting points, our soil, as our colleague spoke to earlier, is a lot different than these countries. The other thing I want to say as a caveat is that we are not country experts. There was an economic historian in the room earlier. We do not purport to be that. But what we are trying to do is to tease out this idea of what can be learned, what kind of environment, what kind of soil produces the results that we're looking for as a country, even though we are starting from very different starting points. So what does labor market evidence already show? These are all leading questions. What is the lived experience from other countries that could be relevant for our specific context? What trade-offs are required for sustainably reducing unemployment? So there are two things that we are particularly interested in, not just in being able to lower unemployment to sort of this low single digits, but to be able to keep this pace up over several decades. And we sort of thrashed it around and we came across sort of 6 country examples that we thought were quite interesting. And the purpose of my presentation today, and it's something that was raised earlier as well, is to try and stimulate and to try and formulate what are the right questions that we should be asking. The paper is available on the SA Tide website for anyone who's interested. It's a very nice, exciting 60-plus pages. I promise you, you'll find it very riveting. It's not like anything else that's going on in the world at the moment. So here's the conclusion at the beginning. Countries that have been successful in this, they tend to have highly productive service sectors that are highly labor absorptive, that grow strongly, and more increasingly have relied on digital infrastructure to help with that. There's a big investment in skills development to capitalize on these identified growth sectors' growth potential. Successful countries tend to support self-employment and informal work. This point was raised yesterday, and I'm very glad when some of the things that I've come across and that I put in my presentations are also commented on by smart people. It's very reassuring. How they've been able to boost self-employment and informal sector work in general is to not have regulatory barriers. That seems intuitive, but we'll speak to maybe some of the examples in a bit more detail. There is a very deliberate attempt to target the financial aid in this endeavor. So it's not necessarily wide sweeping areas of aid, it's very targeted, it's very deliberate. There is a drive in a lot of these successful countries to talk about not just implementing ALMPs, but really thinking about the design of them and tinkering with them where the outcomes are not what you want. Successful countries tend to balance their approach to wage determination. We use this term very deliberately because it is about balance. It's about some flexibility, but it's also not about sacrificing worker protections. There is a trade-off, and that there will be a slide on trade-offs later in the presentation, but this idea that you have to give up something to get something, that tends to come through a lot in successful countries. In this case, wage concessions are traded for employment security, and this really helps to stabilize employment over the longer term. There aren't these big swings in employment and unemployment. There's some intangible that we haven't quite gotten to naming or labeling, but there is some sort of solidarity that we find in a lot of these countries between the employers and employees that does speak to the subject matter for an entire new paper. So if anyone's interested in that work, we'll be happy to talk. Finally, this idea that there is an enabling environment, the soil, and what we found specifically in our case studies was around transport, so linking workers to opportunities, housing policies, as well as training that enables people to take up different kinds of opportunities. so not sector specific. One of the important things that is done, and this will come up in the country examples as well a lot, is around this idea that where something is not working, there is enough impetus, there's enough agility to interrogate that and to try and tweak things to maximize impacts where they are working and maybe to scale down some things that aren't working. So we had, 180 odd countries to look through. We really tried to get some sort of objective measure of including which countries we would want. We've settled on these countries. These are by no means at all the gold standards, but we found that in the high-income country case, Germany, Finland, and Russia, we saw a steady decline in unemployment rates, and there weren't any sort of big swings in terms of interim surges of unemployment. We found that interesting, and we wanted to delve a bit deeper into that. On the upper middle income countries, the more developing countries, we found some good examples in China, Indonesia, and Mexico as well, who were able to maintain low unemployment rates for prolonged periods, and we wanted to dig a little deeper into this. So let's start with the first country example that we had, and I'm going to skim through these. These will be shared with everyone else, so we don't need to go into the nitty-gritty necessarily. But one of the things that Germany is cited for a lot is these Hartz reforms that they decided on in the mid-2000s when many people in this room were obviously studying economics. No, none of you were born. The central idea was this idea to improve the employment services that were already enacted and to try and activate the unemployed to find unemployment. So again, in terms of starting points, this is a different starting point from where we find ourselves in South Africa. But there is nonetheless some lessons that could be drawn from this idea of increasing the flexibility of the labor market and how it worked. What they did was a broad sweeping suite of reforms that were enacted over many years. But really what they focused on was trying to rejig long-term unemployment assistance, introducing a sort of a flat rate benefit, shifting resources more towards startup subsidies to incentivize self-employment, decentralizing wage bargaining to take into account the sector-specific and in many cases the firm-specific circumstances of the employers, introducing and enhancing short-time work schemes and incentivizing job seeking in a big way, which again is maybe less of a problem in South Africa, but be that as it may, these are important examples of trying to do something different, which is what I think is the main point here. Very quickly to talk about this short-time work scheme that I will not pronounce, no matter how much money you'll give me, but really there were two seminal events where the Kurzarbeit was really tested, and it came through to really show that it was quite resilient in these times of crisis. The first being the global financial crisis beginning at the end of 2008, and then in the COVID-19 crisis, where Germany was one of the few countries within high-income countries and within the EU to prevent mass layoffs. And this idea that they were able to prevent that was really a set of policy instruments that allowed firms to use the instruments at their disposal. So it was actually an intervention to have less intervention, is how we've tried to think about it. So firms could really, at short notice, at low cost, implement the short-time work scheme, reduce the number of hours worked by employees. German government comes in to subsidize the payrolls of the affected employees. We do have a similar instrument in South Africa, but I think one of the things that stand out in the German case is the ease with which firms are able to tap that, and they're able to do that quite quickly. And the government comes in within the span of a few months to subsidize the pay once this program is enacted. Program and design and evaluation, again, a very key role. One of the things that they were able to do through this reform process was to be very deliberate and very iterative in the implementation. They were very deliberate in their systematic evaluations of the interventions, and they were able to phase out a lot of the less effective interventions quite quickly. And that's something that I think a lot of economies can draw from. Next, looking to Finland, no jokes on finishing here. I will restrain myself. But essentially what happened with Finland is that they had a massive recession in the 1990s. They saw youth unemployment rates at nearly 34% in 1994, which was massive for them. And as we've seen in earlier presentations, doesn't really faze us too much. Positively, one of the things that happened was that post the recession, they were able to grow quite quickly. So this idea that Prof. Justin was talking about growth it is an enabling factor. Whether or not it's sufficient or not depends on the context, and that's very important. But be that as it may, Finland saw the unemployment rate recover to single digits in the early 2000s. And what really happened with Finland is that this was powered a lot by services, business services, specifically in education, social care. They were very deliberate in the sectors. The government chose winners based on their context. One of the other things as well during recovery was that they saw quite a strong increase in self-employment rates. And that was really the alternative to formal job markets that was able to cushion a lot of the blow of the recession. Last thing to also say is that when we're talking about this idea of solidarity, they were able to manage to attain 0% wage increases just as the recession was peaking across the board, across the country. But in subsequent recovery years, what they saw as well is that the boom industry saw relatively sharp rises in wages. So there was this idea that there was a delay, and once things turned around, a lot of the share of the income that attributed to the labor force did increase quite sharply as well. Final high-income country, depending on where you sit, sometimes ideologically, we looked at Russia, and this idea that Russia was a very paradoxical case in that they had a mixture of rigidity and flexibility that helped with their labor market resilience, and I'll show you why in a minute. So the transition into, from the former USSR, there was a lot of centralization that they inherited in their new dispensation, and that meant that real wages could really, either caps or declines could be enacted very broadly in times of crisis and very uniformly. That being said, they have very stringent employment protection laws. So the cost of dismissing a worker is actually quite high relatively in Russia. So firms would typically respond to that through a combination of reducing working hours as well as wages, rather than outrightly dismissing workers. Additionally, what they employed is a sort of a two-tier wage system. So you had a portion of your wage that was fixed, somewhat guaranteed, rigid, not easily altered, and then there was a variable, flexible one. And the variable part tended to be tied very closely with how a firm performed. And that saw quite wide boom and bust cycles in sort of the wages that employees were subjected to. But there was this fixed part that was always an underlying bedrock. That being said, what that allowed firms to do is to adjust their variable pay during downturns, and they prioritized job retention over sort of rigid wage structures there. And so every time the Russian economy declined, you saw salaries decline and compress in companies. But when the economy improved, salaries also rebounded to a fairly material extent. Looking at our first upper middle income country, developing country, we saw China see a large scale reallocation of labor from what was sort of their rural areas into the urban economy, in part responding to demand. And this is a key theme throughout China, is that they were able to incentivize and sort of stoke demand in the services sector that they had identified as an increasingly strategic sector. The migration was heavily regulated. That being said, there were almost jobs that were cordoned off for sort of migrants moving from rural to urban areas, and a lot of the conditions and sort of the quality of the jobs were not necessarily what one would like. That being said, China also established a very strong informal sector that accounted for a significant share of the economy. Almost 60% of the urban employment in China by sort of the mid-2000s was from in the informal sector. Small enterprises, again, was a deliberate push, by policymakers. What we see now in sort of the spread of employment is that large firms really account for less than 20% of total employment in the Chinese economy, which is largely at odds with our situation. And again, this is the consequence of deliberate government support, specific interventions around innovation, around the cost of borrowing, around building SMME-specific financial aid. Indonesia, the services sector is essentially what dominates in its workforce. It absorbs nearly half of the workforce. The informal sector is a key determinant in that respect. Excuse me. Small and micro enterprises are over 90 or nearly 100% of all the establishments in the country, the registered ones at least. There is a very large informal, unregistered economy as well. That being said, we must flag that there are very low measures of job quality associated with these jobs. There is quite a strong sense of labor market insecurity. Many workers earn less than the minimum wage. And there is also a measurement issue where the low unemployment also masks a lot of the segments of society that are excluded, particularly women from the labor market. Our final case study, again, like Indonesia, what we saw in Mexico, in its ability to keep unemployment in sort of single digits, was this idea that micro enterprises and informal sector was able to absorb a lot of the workforce during shocks. Low social protection in Mexico was actually found to be a catalyst towards the informal sector. So individuals had to essentially look for odd marginal jobs for survival where they couldn't get counted as unemployed and qualify for unemployment benefits that itself was quite thin. Microenterprises, again, were these champions of unemployment. That being said, there was very low compliance with labor codes versus workers that were employed in large firms. There has been some progress in improving sort of the overall business environment and business regulation, and that is key in just how much easier it is for local entrepreneurs to operate in Mexico, and they're even offshoring jobs from their much richer neighbors to the north. There's been quite a strong improvement across the board in terms of access to infrastructure, electricity specifically. Cross-border trade has been made there have been quite a strong advances in that respect. In sort of dispute resolution, that's also been bolstered quite a lot, and that's really improved how informal firms work and the ability of informal firms to ultimately formalize, even if that's not their express intention. Second last slide to talk about trade-offs. So the red bit is if you take nothing else away from the slide, which is very useful in the case of myself, where I can't retain a lot of information. So really, the trade-offs in a lot of these countries, what we're finding is that there's this tension between the quality and the quantity of work. Mexico and Indonesia's case, they owe a large part of their sustained low unemployment to very uncertain, very precarious informal work. Many workers in China lack access to adequate social security measures. There's this also tension in a lot of the case studies with regards to worker protections versus what are broadly encompassed called job enabling reforms. So in Germany, a lot of the much lauded reforms found, or there was an outcome there that there was a lot of wage inequality where a lot of the promotion around jobs at the lower end did see a wage inequality rise in Germany. Russia's economy prioritizing job retention over wage stability was also a key where you saw quite big swings in wages in Russia. The underlying point here again to emphasize is that choices are politically and socially fraught. Last slide, just before I hand over to the next presenter, is around what can we do in our context. So what we found are the key lessons to draw from South Africa's context is this idea that we can expand services-led growth, but it does need the enabling infrastructure. It does need the ability to set up firms to be a lot easier than it is. This again speaks to this idea of self-employment and self-enterprise. Cutting red tape, etc., is something that I think I'm preaching to the converted here. But this idea that the policymakers are very deliberate in targeting self-employment and informal employment, that's something that came through a lot in the case studies. We need to think about how best to recalibrate labor market institutions. We need to have a conversation around flexibility and innovation against labor saving, against labor protections, and that, frankly, is above my pay grade, but these are important conversations to have. We're going to speak today around active labor market policies, and again, a key theme that came through a lot of the case studies was around having evaluations readily available and really rationalizing and tweaking what doesn't work. Spatial inequality is important for us, as it was in other EMs where you saw a mass migration from rural to urban areas. We need to think about improving transport. We really need to think about whether zoning laws are serving us and whether we can bring people closer to jobs and rather not the other way around. I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Boo. Nyeko, you are up and our last speaker before we open for discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Nyeko Mawunda. Gumbi apologized for flu. I'll apologize for lack of sleep. I have an unemployed 31-year-old that decided to move in with me. And he snores. He's my nephew. He calls himself unemployed, but he has a car and does Ubering. So he does have an income, but because he doesn't have a salary, he calls himself unemployed. But he snores. That's the part that I have to apologize about. So that's part of the things that we have to talk about when we talk about the labor market. The issue of income generation as well as employment. And it's something that is a conversation that most of our discussions seems to miss. When we were in Gauteng, Michael will recall, we had a story where we wanted to move to decant, that's the word that we used, Alexandra, and move a number of people that were in Alexandra to a place next to the Baklu, which is owned by Witwatersrand, by the way. And we're supposed to build social housing there and all of that. This old woman told us and said, I get a SASSA grant, old age grant. I then also get 18,000 Rand from the people that are renting in my backyard. And now that means that I have 20,000 Rand that is not taxed, that comes straight to me. You want to move me to a nice place, but I will have no income. Yeah? So now there's a debate that we really need to understand. And when we talk about the labor market, we need to also understand what is it that we're talking about. Income generation and wages. But anyway, I do have a number of colleagues that are with me in the space around, and they will answer some of the difficult questions that are raised. They are the experts in terms of the research that we conduct. But I have to explain that in terms of our priorities, the minister has given us 3 priorities that she has then agreed with the president as part of the presidential minister performance agreement. The 3 are that we must promote safer working environments, we must also facilitate employment, we must also be partners in terms of advocating engagements with employers. And all of these will be done with, in terms of creating a social net for vulnerable workers. And we also have to have a policy balance. So when Gumbi was talking there, he spoke about the need to be flexible. So you do need to have a policy balance in terms of how do we prevent worker exploitation, but also enable the creation of stable and predictable environments that attract business investments as well as job creation. We also have to address the issues that Ngidi spoke about, spoke about earlier on the issue of transforming the economy and the labor market because of our historical injustices that we had. And in addition to that, you have what we call a dual mission, because we have to address those trio priorities. The dual mission talks about the promotion of economic growth, but also the elimination of the false narrative that decent work and job creation cannot go hand in hand. I think it's a false policy issue that has been mentioned earlier. And one of the key issues that we're talking about in terms of the agenda when we're promoting all these the trio priorities is that we need to have social dialogue so that we understand what is it that the employers need, what is it that the employees need, and what is it that those that seek employment need, those that are in the studying and so forth and so forth. And again, the data that is coming out is saying to us we need to be adaptable in terms of the rules that we have so that we support small businesses and emerging industries, especially those ones in the gig and platform economy, but also what we call catalytic industries, such as those in the textile industries, agriculture, and the just energy transition that we have. Now, colleagues have spoken about this, so I'm not going to go through it. I think the Stats SA yesterday spoke about it, and Visache earlier on spoke about the statistics in terms of unemployment, whether it is found. But it's very important for us to know that in 2019, the president changed the name of the department from the Department of Labor to the Department of Employment and Labor. And that was not just a cosmetic change, and that's why we are now even talking about the reforms that we're trying to bring into the department, so that we also elevate the part of employment creation in addition to the issue of decent work and the likes. And there are changes that are coming in, including the separation of the funds, the compensation fund and the UIF, from the department into Schedule 3A entities in terms of the national entities, so that they are able to function in a manner that allows them to actively input into the labor market and have those changes that they need to do. Now, there is a lot of challenges that we have in society, and the biggest one is that, in government rather, and I want to be bold here. I think the biggest failure of the democratic government since 1994 has been the lack of communication. We have a lot of information, we have a lot of initiatives that we're taking, but we do not communicate. I will give you an example in terms of what we do. When there is a strike or service delivery protest, most people see government coming out and saying, no, actually we'll be bringing the road next week. But we all know that roads are not built in a week, or they're not brought in a week. That it means that there was a plan that it was supposed to be there. Recently, there has been a march on illegal immigration and illegal or undocumented migrants in South Africa. And then government comes out and says, we actually have a new policy on managing labor migration. We have a new policy on the white paper on migration into the country. And this work started in 2022, 2023, from both the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Employment and Labor. And now people are saying, you are responding to what we, the people, have been saying, instead of communicating that. So in the department, we have 2 units that actively conduct research, and that's why I can confirm all these issues that are being raised by colleagues. But what we do is that when we finish with the research, we post it on the website and hope that someone is going to come and have a look at it, which then becomes a problem. And the first unit is the one that actively look at labor market information and statistics. We collect the information, we analyze the information on labor market data, And we provide that information to inform planners, National Treasury, Statistics South Africa, SADC, the AU, the cabinet, the colleagues in government. They use this information. We also have the Research Policy and Planning Unit, a full planning unit, research unit within the department. And with that, we actively plan for research within BRICS. We drafted the terms of references. We work with colleagues from the HSRC, in academia, and we produce a number of documents and reports annually that I can tell none of you will know unless if you are actively working or working with us or in the labor market. Okay, it was still safe, I guess. But I wanted to highlight a number of them. For me, the biggest ones is that we have what we call the Annual Industrial Action Report. And that Industrial Action Report looks at the industrial actions and labor peace within the country. We hear a lot of people saying that there's a lot of strikes, work stoppages, and all of that. But none of us try to understand what is it that causes those things and what are the impacts of those things. And that's what we're trying to have with that. This is a report that we produce annually. I don't know how many of you knows about that report. We also have a report that looks at job opportunity and unemployment in the SA labor market. Now, this report looks at which positions are in the labor market that are difficult to fill. And that way we can say these are the scarce skills. Universities, please start training in this area. Government departments, employers, provide bursaries in this area. And these are things that are actively intervening in the labor market. But we don't share that information, and I hope that with this type of engagements with GTAC and partnering with us, we will be able to start sharing so that colleagues can understand. And there are a number of interesting studies that we have done throughout the years, including how the synthesis of labor legislation or an investigation into the rigidity and flexibility of labor laws. So we wanted to see what is it that people are saying. When they say that labor laws are rigid, what does that mean? And what we found out is that it means that if you are an employer, Gumbi, you just want to be able to wake up one day and say, Nyiko, you are fired. And that's what all the employers said. They say, it's my company, I must have that flexibility. Then we come back and say, but you also have to understand that South Africa is a human rights-based society. Workers' rights are unalienable human rights. You cannot separate the two. So there must be processes that addresses and allows you to be followed so that you can have that sense of fairness. So what is it that makes us want to regulate? Because we were asked the question before, why do you want to, why do you think you must regulate the labor market? And we have the Constitution. We are one of about, I think, 3 countries in the world that have as constitutional rights, a basic human right, labor relations, a fair labor practices. I think it's only 3 countries in the world in the Constitution. So if we have that in the Constitution, you'll understand in the history that was being shared earlier, why would want to have that? So you need to find a balance between employers, job creation, as well as the rights of individuals as basic human rights. We also have a lot of collective agreements with the organized labor, with business as well. We also have a lot of bilateral cooperations. You know, surprisingly, South Africa has a lot of bilateral agreements with countries where we are allowed to send labor to these countries, but we do not communicate that. We only communicate about those countries that send labor to us And we need to start marketing those areas so that young South Africans can take the opportunities that we have there. We also have multilateral organizations, agreements that we have, or obligations with the SADC, with the African Union. With the SADC now, we're working in partnership with States SA to align with on the SADC labor statistic protocol that will allow us to know across the SADC region the issues related to the labor market, the issues related to labor migration, what the challenges are, what are the pull factors, what are the push factors, so that we can start even addressing not only South African needs, but also the regional needs that we have. I'm trying to move as fast as possible. I know it's a lot of information. I wanted to read this quote by Minister Met. You know, in government, I'm shocked you didn't quote Minister Godongwana, but he spoke yesterday, so you are fine. In government, you have to quote your minister so that you remain relevant. That's a joke. I've also heard that in the social media, you have to post your boss once a year so that your boss can know that you're still, aligned. Anyway, I quote, it says, when she was delivering the budget vote speech, she said, South Africa faces a structural unemployment crisis. Our mandate cannot just be about protecting those who already have jobs. It must actively welcome those who are excluded. However, creating any job at any cost is a trap. Working poverty destroys social cohesion. Our challenge is to build a regulatory environment that is firm on rights but flexible on formalization. And that means that it actually reflects on what my colleagues from the HSRC will talk about. Because when we looked at the youth employment poverty solutions adopted by government in the research that we did, we found that there is a need for understanding that high unemployment requires rapid job creation. But it also means that when you look at unregulated growth, there is a challenge there that you are going to have a lot of exploitation and worker poverty. The statistics that we have from inspections show that the biggest industries that are exploitative and hire large numbers of illegal immigrants are the ones that are quite low on regulation. Those are agriculture and construction. And that's where you have a lot of exploitation and non-payment of national minimum wage. And last is that whilst the solution is a regulated flexibility that allows maneuver, it also lowers the issues of barriers of entry. And the BEEI, not the BBE, not the triple BE, the BEEI is a project actually funded by the Unemployment Insurance Fund from the Department of Employment and Labor. We're almost done, yeah. So all of those things are reflecting on the challenges that are being spoken about earlier. And in this current financial year, in terms of our APP, we will be doing two major reports. One will be looking again on the impact of labor legislation and employment creation, so that we can come back and report on what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. And then the next one will be the issue of labor market trends. I wanted to highlight, as I move towards closure, the issue of why we need to have compliance. The first one is that when you look in the vulnerable industries like construction, especially the ones that we say are going to make our economy to be a construction space, that when you are unable to comply, those that are undercutting or are not complying, they are able to underbid, so they come into the environment and say, we'll pay at the lower rate. They lead to substandard working conditions. Then you have the buildings that are collapsing all over the country, the infrastructure that is falling off. They have illegal employment practices, and all of this undermines the economy. So it's not a matter of whether you need to comply or not. It's also a matter of whether the economy is supposed to be working in the way in which we're working. I'm going to move a little bit because I wanted to talk about what we are actually doing as a department to address the issue of unemployment and the economy. The first one is we have a project called the Labor Activation Program, which we have revised actually, and it is an investment in the economy, where we want to target what we call catalytic industries, such as those in technology, those that are in green energy, just energy transition, in construction, in textile. We also want, with the revised strategy, it says that whatever you do, the beneficiaries must be 70% youth. And we also have the public employment portal within the department, where we say to young people, register your CV, and we have partnered with 1,000 CEOs, and we say to them, advertise on the platform. And we will take the responsibility to verify and vet the young people that are there, so that you cannot claim that you cannot find job opportunities or you cannot find skills in the economy that are there. We're also removing the issue of barriers to entry. Young people have said to us in the work integrated learning, the WIL, they are not able to complete their studies because they finish the theoretical work, but the physical work they are not able to do. I see a lot of young people nodding on the floor, and we have said as a Department of Higher Education and Training, give us the list of those that have completed the theoretical planning, the theoretical part of it. They gave us a list of 39,000 young people that cannot graduate because they do not have WIL part of their training. And we have said we will allocate you to positions and will pay stipends so that you are able to go to jobs, you are able to buy clothes to allow you to be in those areas. But we'll also provide some skills auditing or skills analysis, provide career path counseling, provide career guidance and pathways, so that you are able to move beyond just the WIL part and be able to move to the next level of jobs. Lastly, I think at an economic conference like this, we often hear that strict labor laws kill jobs, or that total deregulation drives growth. But I think we have shown with this presentation that challenges that binary type of thinking. It gives a false policy thinking. And from the department's perspective, regulation and employment creation are not enemies, they are two sides of the same coin. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nico. Very, very helpful. And I think a really nice way to round out the presentations. So I need to make a deal with the audience. And that deal is, given the richness of the presentations we've heard, we're going to have a trade-off. And that trade-off includes your tea break. So if you'll give me 10 extra minutes, then we can go into a Q&A session, which I think you're probably all itching to go into. So can I agree that we have struck said bargain and we can move on accordingly?
Agreed.
Sounds like a plan. All right, on we go. And before we open to the floor for Q&A, I would like for us to do two things. The first is, I know we've got a colleague in the audience from the HSRC, but I'm going to ask you to make your intervention in literally 2 minutes to give a little bit of color to some of the helpful points that Nico had made. And then I'm going to ask for Michael to give us some initial responses to the richness of presentations that we've heard this morning. So shall we go in that order?
Good morning. Can you hear me? Great. Shireen Mutala, Human Sciences Research Council. I'm going to try and do the Speedy Gonzalez. Just a disclaimer, the study, and Nyeko has already referred to the study on the screen, is not a representative sample. The lack of, and this is a theme that almost everyone has spoken to, the lack of an effective monitoring and evaluation system in South Africa is a huge impediment to evidence base to help us. And that was evident in the study, because We could not get a single government department of the 40 different interventions nationally in the public sector who could, because of a lack of POPIA compliance, could provide databases for us. So we had to go to the public through various social media, etc., to develop a database of 14,000 people, particularly with the help of Harambee. And out of that, we eventually secured 2,400 reports. So this is not a representative sample. That's the first disclaimer. The second one is that the typologies were the demand side, the supply side, the misalignment programs, as well as the comprehensive programs. We did not get sufficient responses across those programs as well. So I think that's the first disclaimer. The evidence has already been presented by most people. Employment outcomes, full-time, were very low. Overall, it was 14%. Study, 6%, etc. Very, very low levels of self-employment, and I think we've all spoken to that again over here. What was really interesting was that the lowest outcomes in employment were in where? In the Tibet sector, in the second chance matric. And this again speaks to a lack of a theory of change, because what is the expectation of a program such as theory of change? In terms of just some of the things around supply side, between 2008 and 2015, we grew the artisanal program, right, by 2%, from 42% to 44%. Yet we have a massive backlog on artisanal infrastructure, but we haven't grown that sector. Our second chance matric, and people like Gustafsson and others have written large amounts of money being put into that, yet the outcomes, when 16% of the participants actually completed their matric, 16% of 300,000, right? Wasteful resources, money down the drain, and very few of those even secured any form of employment. What was really interesting was actually the retention question. And there again, we were asking, did you secure some kind of employment? PYEI program had one of the highest levels of retentions, followed by internship programs, work experience following graduate programs. So I want to move now to actually just a few high-level findings. We lack a unified, coordinated system in South Africa for managing youth employment. It's multiple institutions. There's efforts in the National Pathways Management. There's a lot more that needs to happen.
Just so you know, they
We
are going to
redefine
take you back
what we
to
mean by
screens
policy
once we...
implementation success. It can't be the numbers, the throughputs. It has to be beyond that. And we don't have enough of the indicators. We don't have enough of effort around self-employment, etc. We're lacking, again, disaggregated youth profiles and programs related to those youth profiles. We lack that. So it's one size fits all, yet what the person without the matric and the person with the degree, what their pathways are completely different. We have huge supply, huge supply. Some of it is mass, and it's really good, like the Jobs Fund and Social Employment Fund, and others which are so micro and small, and little coordination, little standard, determination, etc. We can't continue to spend the kind of monies that we're spending there. And then the demand side, there have been some really interesting studies that even question the ETI, the Employment Tax Incentive. So I think just to conclude, Chair, because of the time, etc., there are lots of opportunities out there. The high multiplier effects, etc., that people have raised, we're not maximizing those. Not in the waste sector, not in the energy sector, etc. We've got a room full of people here and others in the sector that need to find ways to work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for helping us with the time as well. Very useful reflections. So with all of that said, Michael, any initial reflections on what we've heard this morning?
Thank you very much, and thanks for GTAC and to Treasury inviting me here. I'm very at home on this panel because I used to work at Treasury with Sibusiso and Boypuso, and then when I left, I went to work at Gauteng with Nico. And then when I left there, I went to work at Wits with Justin and Spelele. So I'm very much at home. It's been a very rich conversation and a very important conversation. And I wanted to start with Justin's locating this debate in the economics of the Great Depression and saying that the Great Depression created this burning platform around unemployment that was solved with government interventions, particularly on the demand side, and how economics at the time of the Great Depression was not well developed to respond to the problems that the Great Depression came up with, and so Keynes and others developed these ideas of macroeconomics and the separating or looking more at the demand side and its role in sustaining an economy. And I'd make two comments about that. The first is that South Africa's unemployment, high levels of our unemployment, are clearly not a problem of a low demand equilibrium like they were in the Great Depression. So when the USA faced unemployment rates of 25 or 30% during the Great Depression, the question they asked themselves is, we have all of these factories that a few years ago were producing goods and supplying goods into the economy. Now the factories are empty, nobody is working there. So how do we go back to where we were a few years ago when we had full employment? That was the question that was posed by the Great Depression. And it was clear that macroeconomic demand stimulus was required to shift the economy from this equilibrium it found itself in back to the equilibrium in which there was full employment. So there was a coordination problem in the economy leading to this mass unemployment, which government could fix, and Keynes articulated a way to fix that problem. That doesn't well describe the problem in South Africa. Probably the best paper, in my view, on the emergence of mass unemployment in South Africa is by Banerjee and Woolard and others, was part of the Treasury's Harvard project in the 2000s. And it described a perfect storm associated very much with the process of democratization itself. Because on the one hand, you had, in labor, when we talk about labor, it gets the supply and the demand side gets confusing because there's also a supply side, the supply of labor and the demand for labor and such things. But on the supply of labor, democracy meant a huge shock, a huge positive, if you like, increase in the supply of labor. Remember, apartheid was a system for confining black people to Bantustans and townships. And it led to these huge spatial imbalances. And in the period immediately after democracy, you saw an unwinding of those spatial imbalances and people moving into the urban environment and offering themselves as workers. The same for women. A very large increase in the female labor force participation rate taking place in the 1990s. So you had particularly lower skilled people offering themselves for employment that under apartheid were kept out of the labor market. At exactly the same time, and I don't think they say this in the paper, but you could draw the following conclusion. Those industries that again relied on the suppression of worker rights, the suppression of wages, and the treatment of low-skilled black labor as some kind of natural resource, and I'm talking here in particular about mining and agriculture. Those, as we transitioned into democracy, those sectors shed hundreds of thousands of jobs, forced people off the land who had previously been working on the land, and the mines became lower employed. So we were left with not so much a temporary equilibrium, but a permanent state of affairs in which we have this mass unemployment. And so that's kind of the first point. The second point is that I think that there's been a second revolution in economics, if you like. There was the Keynesian revolution that divided, that gave us the tools to think differently about supply side and demand side. But since the 2008 financial crisis, there's been a new revolution in economics which recognizes the failure of mainstream economics to take seriously the question of inequality. And it hasn't quite yet generated its Keynes or Keynesian moment or a new theoretical architecture. But it has placed these questions that Siphelele raises about exclusion and social exclusion and the reproduction of inequality should have placed it at the center of economics. And if we think about inequality from the point of view of economic policy, we can then talk about redistribution, which is redistributing demand, taking, as I think Justin mentioned, a rand in taxation from an affluent person and giving it to a poor person is a redistribution in demand that is likely to result in increased demand because the affluent and the rich tend to save, are able to save, whereas, as Josh's presentation was showing, the poor will tend to spend that money. But there's also a question of pre-distribution, as they call it. In other words, the underlying supply conditions, if you like, that create this inequality. And so I think I'm trying to complicate that we shouldn't say it's is it supply or is it demand? Unemployment is so important in South Africa that we should be broadening our scope and asking both the supply and the demand questions. And I would say that most of our policy interventions that I can see now are more focused on the supply side, and by which I mean the supply of labor, improving the supply of labor in some way. Whereas the demand side intervention that we have, whether it be the public employment programs or the COVID SRD, are conceived of and designed not as permanent supply-side responses, but as demand stimulus responses, temporary demand stimulus responses. So in conclusion, I would say it's clear that growth is centrally important to employment creation. And I think we're doing well on identifying and addressing the constraints for economic growth. But at the center of economic policy in South Africa has to be also employment. And I think we need to think in terms of marshalling all of the state's resources behind some employment objective. And this means consolidating and marshalling rather than fragmenting policy across the skills system, across the public employment programs. We now have 3, EPWP, CWP, PEP, across the active labor market policies that have been spoken about. And also, I think, as Pelele mentions, taking seriously the state's role as a pathway to employment. On the one hand, as he correctly pointed out, recruitment into the police force is one of the few avenues available to young people with only a matric qualification. You only need matric to join the police. The same with the defense force. So when we think about employment policy, are those kind of things also on the table as elements of how we can increase the absorption of labor? Because I think Justin's argument is compelling, that even if we resolve the growth, even if we have growth reaching 3%, and we're putting all of our effort into that, and that's fundamentally important, not least to sustain a public intervention on employment. But even if we do all of that, we're likely to be left with unacceptably high levels of unemployment. And then we need to ask, how can we marshal all of these policies to more effectively expand the absorption of labor into the economy? I think should be, after growth, visible as the central thrust of government economic policy.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so you've heard from all of us, and it would be great to hear from you. We don't have a lot of time, but I would like to open up for a round of questions. I'll take some in the room, and those of you who are online, please also send your questions. Vos is going to be very helpfully be fielding those. I'm going to try and take 2 rounds of questions, and I'm going to try to get 5 questions in. That means you need to be brief and you need to be sharp, so we can get the panel to respond to you. I am going to start in the back, and I'm going to come forward. So I'm going to go in that way. 1, ma'am, look forward. 2, 3, 4, 5. So in the second round, we're going to start there, and in the other hand, you remember who you are, keep each other accountable so you can get your options in the second round. Vusi, can we take 1 question online? Do we have?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, in that order, please go. Short and sharp, please.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm Kamkhelo Medise. I just have 2 questions, one for Prof. Vasachi and one for Nico. So I'm going to start with Prof. Vasachi. In relation to your slides on social grants, you referred social grants as a safety net, quote unquote, which is true. Social grants have alleviated poverty in many South African households. However, they somewhat coincide with high NEET rates as well as high unemployment rates. So,
Kamogelo, I'm going to need you to get straight to your question.
Okay.
Context is great. What's your question?
Okay, at what point does the evidence suggest that welfare expansion creates dependency traps which ultimately reduce labor supply and undermine the urgency of structural reforms in labor markets? And then for Nico, I was looking at the national list of occupations in demand. So I just want to ask, with occupations like personal assistant and office administrator, these people are largely in the database of the Department of Employment and Labor. So I just want to ask, are they truly scarce skills, or are they oversupplied ones that happen to still show vacancy or wage growth? Thanks.
Thanks, Kamogelo. There was another hand. Yep, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bulela Njemla. I'm a second-year master's student in applied economics from UCT. I have a question on the presentation, where will jobs come from? A question specifically on skills mismatch. As I was watching or listening to the amazing presentation, it seems like skills mismatch was portrayed as a demand-driven, or was driven by demand shift in the economy. So I have a question on what has the country done, or what do you think the country has done to close this gap, and how far do we still have to go, especially as we see the emergence of AI on the very same sectors, services sector, that are driving the skills gap. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. I think we were going... No, I think there was a hand on that side. And then we're going to come this way.
Good morning. My name is Yangama Jake from Nelson Mandela University. I'm a master's candidate and in economics. My question is short. If private capital decides whether to invest and create jobs, are we asking the government to solve a problem it does not fully control?
It's an excellent question.
Michael will
Over
answer
there.
that one.
Greetings. My name is Apiwe Mbutuma, and I'm from the University of the Free State. I'm a master's candidate studying public administration and management. So my question, I have 2 questions actually. My first question is going to Prof. Justin. So in your presentation, you mentioned that we have approximately 70% of the jobs that are supposed to be occupied by South Africans are occupied by immigrants. And I would like to believe that in that 70%, we'll also have illegal immigrants. Now, my question is, how can we actually get illegal immigrants to live and also minimize immigration in South Africa without actually being viewed as a xenophobic country? Because I think we need to maintain the relationship that we have with other African countries, because Africa is very rich in primary sector resources which have a potential of improving our economic growth? And then the second question is going to almost all the speakers because they mentioned this. So if you are saying the informal economy is also, okay, so basically you're promoting the informal economy, right? So my question is, are we gonna ignore that the informal sector doesn't necessarily contribute in terms of revenue, which also puts a strain in most of the public institutions? And now I'm a bit concerned about the promotion of informal economy because now does that mean the formal economy is gonna stop creating job opportunities for us because they expect us to branch into the informal economy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one more hand in the front, and then we're going to close it there for now. Then we'll take the one online.
Thank you so much. My name is Talenta Mabasa, and I am a PhD candidate in economics. I do focus on macroeconomic growth as well as financial development. My question is, we've seen obviously from years that there is a numerous youth employment interventions, but unemployment still remains to be very high. So from an evaluation perspective, do we know whether the problem lies in the designing of the program, maybe the implementation fidelity, or maybe broader macroeconomic environment? So if we are to maybe increase economic growth, or if economic growth were to accelerate significantly, would the interventions, or rather the existing interventions become substantially more effective, or would we still need to require fundamental redesign regardless of the growth environment? Another question is based on the remarks.
Sorry, dear, I'm going to have to cut you off there because we're going to hit the time constraint. Can you please give us that question in writing and we can get it to your panel so that you get your response? Okay. Can we do it that way? Thank you so much. I want to hear from at least one person online. Or what questions do you have for us, Vusa?
Yeah, we do have a question from Spelela Kubisa saying, according to Stats SA, unemployment has averaged 32% over the past few years. At the same time, inflation has remained relatively low and stable. Given the traditional Phillips curve trade-off, has this prolonged period of high unemployment contributed to keeping inflation subdued? And if we aggressively pursue job creation, do we risk destabilizing inflation and broader macroeconomic stability?
Excellent question. Thanks, Vusa. Okay, so quite a few questions. My ambition for 2 rounds, I am not going to meet, I'm afraid. But those of you who still have questions, please do send them to us in writing. The team will be able to help, and we'll try and get back to you as well, so you do get responses to your question. Let me open to the floor. Colleagues, let's keep it short and sharp and see how many of these we can field. If anything is still hanging, we'll get back to our colleagues in the lunch breaks. I'm sure we'll find each other in the corridors as well. So shall we start as we are sitting? In this way, please respond to anything that's been fielded in your direction.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the skills mismatch, I think my colleague from the Department of Labor will be able to answer that in terms of what is done. But as I spoke about the crowding out, and as individuals who are low-skilled are being crowded out, we need new avenues, we need new pathways. And the informal sector is one of those pathways. But however, we must not romanticize it. As you have already correctly stated, that large portions of those in the informal sector do not even earn above the poverty wage, never mind the living wage. So we need to create sort of an ecosystem that enables these individuals to move from being survivalist to individuals who thrive, right? And also the informal sector enables us, if policy enables us to have inclusive growth, because through encouraging this and supporting it, we are able to ensure that the next round of growth, we uplift those in the formal and the informal, because the informal consists of those who are lowly educated and stuff. So if our urban policy consists or is intentional in supporting the informal sector, right? And not just say, oh, people must go there in the informal sector and not support them, but is intentional. We can be able to ensure inclusive growth, ensuring that development that happens and the bread that is generated from that development goes in every corner of South Africa.
Great. Hopelessly over time, so cherry picking. Around social grants, I don't think anyone thinks that social grants are a substitute for proper economic participation. I think that's been the main frustration. However, I also don't think that anyone really thinks that social grants are sort of a disincentive to working or anything like that either. I think the real conundrum is that it can redistribute, but it's not really enabling people to participate. Having said that, the attraction of some form of universal basic income is that the state can administer it really effectively and cheaply. So all of these other programs, a lot of complexity, etc., where just putting money in people's pockets, and as Michael pointed out, it can be a demand stimulus, we can do that effectively. So clearly it's part of the package, but not enough. There was a question around what ultimately is the role for government? It doesn't create the jobs. If that question's coming from a kind of perspective of that we just need the markets to do what they should do, I think the response here is, well, South Africa is your case in point, right? If you've got such high levels of inequality and you just leave the markets to do what they do, will it really get us from where we need to go? The answer is no. There needs to be a strong state because any free market is operating within rules of the game that are ultimately set by the public sector. So again, that's a bit of a false dichotomy. Yes, private sector must create jobs, but clearly the state has a big role to play. And in our own context where the economy is not probably going to grow enough, certainly within my lifetime, we need to think more seriously about the role of the state. And I won't talk about illegal immigration, come talk to me after, but I'll end by just also responding to Michael to say, I think the point about the Keynesian moment is not that we need Keynesian economics. I think the point about the Keynesian moment is that it forced economists to ask some different questions. And I think that our particular moment in South Africa should force us not just to do the same thing, but really think seriously about the kind of outcomes we have versus the sort of standard solutions that we give. I think that's the real lesson. Thanks.
Josh?
Thanks. I'll be also very quick. The one I just wanted, the point I want to go on is the question at the end, which was saying, I think very fairly, we have all of these youth unemployment problems, all these youth unemployment programs, but it just seems so intractable. And I think the way to think about that is that the problem is really big and structural, and no one program is going to solve everything. But I think it is an important point that we should be experimenting, as people have said, with our interventions. Are they working? And I think for me, one of the things that comes out of this is there's a lot of ideas, but we don't actually have a very clear idea of this is how you get things fixed. What the programs we have done have often been, as Michael spoke about, I think supply-side interventions, getting people looking for work, that kind of stuff. And I just don't think, as we've heard today, that that's really the key constraint. The key constraint is there aren't enough jobs. And so what you want, I think, is programs which are experimenting, as Justin said, across different things, driving growth, driving reforms which encourage labor absorbing growth, industrial policy, increasing demand. Michael spoke about that history, a massive increase in supply of labor and while declining demand for labor. And so I think government needs to do its job. It is the private sector, so it's tough, but create incentives or an enabling environment for labor absorbing growth. But that is really difficult, and we should be realistic about that. So we should be serious about the evaluation, try lots of different things and see what works. And while we're doing that, recognize that's going to take a long time, and that's when you need these policies which, as I think Justin just said now, get money into people's hands, whether that's social grants or public employment programs, which, while those keep people going while we're also trying other kind of long run things. And the last quick point, the question about illegal immigration, I couldn't quite see from online, but I don't think that Justin's slide was saying that 70% of jobs in South Africa are held by immigrants. I mean, that would be that's not what the statistic is. I think the statistic was about what people perceive to be the major issue. So I just want to just clarify that. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, thank you so much. I think on the you threw me there. I think Modise, firstly on the skills mismatch, what we have found is that the employers or the private sector, even in departments actually, employers expect an individual to come from university already ready to work. And personally, I don't think anyone can graduate today and they are ready tomorrow to work. You will have the theoretical background, the tools, the systems, but you will not have that understanding of the environment at the job. So it creates that false idea of a skills mismatch, which doesn't exist. Teachers, engineering students, medical students, lawyers, when they finish their university degrees, they go into what do you call this? There's a learnership program that they go to that is formalized as part of their training. But we expect all the other sectors of the environment or the economy to think that the learners or graduates are ready. And that's a thing that we really need to fix. It's a structural mismatch that can be fixed. On the issue of executive personal assistants, I think it's a misnomer that we're using there. It's not actually personal assistants, and people mistake those two. We're talking about executive assistants. There's what we call administrative assistants. People that can do normal things like providing administrative support, setting meetings and all of that. And then there are those executive assistants that you have, even that they get paid way, way more in the industry and even in government, in fact. And those are the ones that are sought after because they are scarce skills in terms of having that level of acumen and technical understanding, and even protecting you as an executive sometimes from yourself, by saying, don't go there, don't meet with this one and do all that. And that's what the economy, it's not the department that is saying these are the skills that are in shortage, it's the labor market that says, we are unable to get this level of skill set that we need to have in the things. There's one part, the last one, I think is from Apiwe. I think that for South Africans, firstly, they are not xenophobic, but that I'm going to leave that there. It's just that we have not enforced our immigration laws for a long time. And now that they are being enforced and people start to think that it's why are we doing it now? It's about aboutism instead of the actual work that must be done. On the issue of the informal economy, from my side, I doubt that South Africa truly does have an informal economy. And I've heard this argument somewhere and people thought that I'm crazy. I say this because if you go to Tanzania or Mozambique or wherever, there will be someone who wakes up in the morning, goes into the ocean, grabs a little bit of fish, comes back, buys for you, gives it to you. Informal, nothing. In South Africa, there's no such as an informal economy. The informal economy that you have in South Africa is intrinsically linked to the formal economy. Whether it's the bush mechanics, whether it's the lady that is selling sweets on the street, Magwinya or wherever. Those people, they buy flour from the supermarket, they buy oil, they buy parts, they buy all of those things. So we really need to talk about formalization of that sector that is not even and all of that. And Ms. Mabasa, congratulations on your PhD. I think you already have it. Thanks.
Sbu, 30 seconds.
I only have one point. It was Talente's point on evaluation. So the ETI has been subject to 3 different rounds of evaluation across academia and also through NEDLAC. And Prof. Vimal Ranchod, who presented yesterday, has a view on the ETI. Joshua on the call has a view on the ETI. Dr. Ibrahim, who will come a bit later, has a view on the ETI. Nedlak has a view on the ETI. I want the same scrutiny for every single major labor activation program in the country. Every labor activation program that goes through DAL must be subject to the same scrutiny, to the point made earlier of our colleague from the HSRC. Every major initiative that we want to do to tackle this problem, I want the same level of scrutiny as was subjected to the ETI and now the teaching assistant program that Justin had. That's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Boo. Mike, do you have 30 seconds?
Well, I would just repeat that I don't think it's helpful to say this is the job of the private sector or the public sector or something like that. What is necessary is that really we are not on a sustainable path. And it's not unsustainable. I mean, it is, we have trouble with the fiscus, but I'm not talking primarily about the fiscus. I'm saying we're not on a sustainable path because, as I think others have shown, the formal sector growth, I mean, there's still about 12 million people employed in the formal sector. If you go back to the beginning of the QLFS, it was something like 11, right? But if you go back to the beginning of the QLFS, there were 6 million people saying they're unemployed. Now there are 12 million people saying they're unemployed. Whereas the formal sector has basically not grown. Now, you can convert that into fiscal arithmetic and say people who are in the formal sector are the taxpayers, whereas people who don't have a job are the people who are going to be depending on that taxation. So the whole path of the economy is on is unsustainable. We need to generate a burning platform that brings together, consolidates, and marshals various interventions around employment and job creation. That needs to be to have as much coherence and effectiveness as our interventions to grow the economy have generated in the last few years.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for giving up your tea break to accommodate us, and sorry for those coming in. But I think we've had a very rich discussion and a lot of ground to cover in very little time. So thank you to all of you. For all of you who want to know about the ground and the nature of the soil to plant the tree and what we do to grow the economy, that's what I do. And they very strategically gave me the mic, so I can't talk about it, but do find me in the corridors and I'll tell you my views on that. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your involvement. Bye.